For years, the public asked a question that seemed impossible to reconcile with the image they were given. How could one of the world's most fearless action stars, a man celebrated for running toward danger, hanging from aircraft, leaping between skyscrapers, and risking his life repeatedly for entertainment, seemingly vanish from the everyday life of his own daughter? And why did that absence stretch not for months or a few years, but for more than a decade, leaving behind a silence so complete that it became louder than any explanation ever offered? A silence that Suri Noel Holmes, the young woman once known to the world as Suri Cruise, carried quietly from childhood into adulthood without public complaint, interviews, or dramatic statements, choosing instead to speak through the life she slowly and deliberately built far from her father's shadow, a life that, when examined closely, reveals a story heavier and more painful than celebrity headlines ever suggested. It begins on April 18, 2006, at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, where Suri was born into an environment shaped not only by fame, but by strict belief systems that were never of her choosing, as her mother, actress Katie Holmes, later acknowledged following what were described as Scientology-influenced silent birth practices. Enduring labor without vocal expression, while observers enforced rituals she did not create, a moment that has since been interpreted by critics as emblematic of a larger power imbalance, though supporters described it as devotion, and Holmes herself later framed it as survival. And while Suri could not remember that day, its consequences echoed throughout her childhood, because from the very beginning her life unfolded inside a world meticulously engineered to appear perfect from the outside, complete with red carpets, magazine covers, luxury homes, security teams, and the image of a golden Hollywood family, while behind closed doors, according to friends and later reporting, tensions were already forming, as Holmes's parents and close confidants grew increasingly alarmed by the level of control surrounding their daughter and granddaughter, noting that Holmes was rarely alone, frequently accompanied by associates linked to the Church of Scientology, who, by multiple accounts, monitored movements, schedules, and social interactions in ways that felt less like protection and more like surveillance, though none of this was visible to a young child, who experienced only what children understand: footsteps in the hallway, movie nights, a father who seemed larger than life, and the comfort of routine, until that routine ended abruptly. Because when Suri was 6 years old, the footsteps stopped, the house went quiet, and the man who once held her hand in public and spoke of her as a miracle disappeared from her daily life without warning or explanation. June 2012 marked the rupture, when Katie Holmes filed for divorce just days before Tom Cruise's 50th birthday, in a move that stunned Hollywood not because celebrity marriages fail, but because this one ended with unprecedented speed, finalized in just 11 days. And while the public framed it as a sudden decision, later accounts revealed that Holmes had been planning her exit for months with extraordinary caution, changing phones repeatedly, avoiding certain areas of the house she believed were monitored, quietly replacing staff she feared were reporting back to the church, and holding her daughter close each night with the awareness that one misstep could cost her custody, ultimately choosing New York as the legal battleground because its courts favored a child's stability, and filing while Cruise was overseas filming, ensuring he would learn of the divorce the same way the rest of the world did, through headlines, a move that insiders described as strategic rather than emotional. And court documents later confirmed that Holmes's primary concern was securing the right to raise her daughter outside Scientology, amid fears voiced by former members and reported publicly that as Suri grew older she could face pressure to enter the church's Sea Org program, something Holmes was determined to prevent at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing her career momentum, personal safety, and privacy. The settlement granted Holmes full custody, with Cruise agreeing to substantial child support and expenses, but what money could not buy was presence, and within days, Holmes and Suri left Los Angeles quietly for New York, beginning a life defined not by extravagance, but by protection, routine, and absence. And for Suri, that absence soon became the defining feature of her childhood, because while most children grow up with fathers woven into their daily memories, school events, bedtime stories, weekend trips, Suri's memories of her father became frozen snapshots from before she turned 6, images that slowly faded as the years passed, replaced by a strange Duality in which she existed everywhere on screens, billboards, and movie posters, but nowhere in her lived reality. A contradiction that grew heavier with each birthday marked without a call, a message, or public acknowledgement. And although media reports as early as 2013 suggested Cruz had seen his daughter only once since the divorce, with no confirmed visits afterward. For Suri, this was not a mystery or a scandal, but simply the shape of her life, a life in which she learned emotional independence early, riding subways alone, finishing school projects quietly, standing at curbs watching friends embraced by their fathers, and pretending it did not hurt, not because she was strong by nature, but because children adapt when they must, carrying disappointment silently to protect the parent who stayed. As she grew older, questions sharpened from where is dad to why doesn't he come, and eventually to the realization that absence is not always caused by distance or schedules, but by choices shaped by beliefs larger than any single relationship, a realization that began to crystallize during her early teens when fragments of adult conversations she had overheard for years. Words like Scientology, custody, control, restrictions, finally started to make sense, especially during the isolation of the pandemic, when she had time to search for answers on her own, reading interviews, documentaries, and testimonies from former members describing policies that discouraged close relationships with those outside the organization, including family members, a pattern that did not name her directly, but nonetheless explained the architecture of her silence. And while no one could claim to know precisely what choices were made behind closed doors, Suri understood enough to recognize that she existed on the outside of a system that demanded loyalty. And that realization did not turn into hatred, because children rarely hate their parents, but into something quieter and more enduring. Grief for a living person, the ache of waiting for someone who does not arrive. By the time she turned 15, the unspoken truth between mother and daughter had grown heavy, marked by moments like the morning Suri found Katie Holmes wiping away tears after reading yet another article celebrating Cruz's latest blockbuster. A moment that required no questions because the answer was shared. And throughout it all, Holmes maintained a strict refusal to speak publicly against her former husband, choosing instead to shield her daughter from adult bitterness and letting time reveal what explanations could not, until Suri reached adulthood herself, and turning 18 in April 2024 became not just a birthday, but a legal and emotional threshold, the moment she could finally define her own identity without permission. And in the weeks leading up to it, she poured years of silence into college application essays, writing lines like, "Sometimes we don't grow up with love, we grow up with the space that love leaves behind." Words that never named her father, yet required no clarification, because the world already knew the outline of her story even if it never heard her voice. And on May 17, 2024, she made the quiet decision that symbolized the end of waiting, legally changing her name to Suri Noel Holmes, choosing her mother's middle name not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of clarity. A declaration that she no longer wished to carry a surname associated more with absence than connection, a change that appeared first in a graduation program, then in theater cast lists, and finally in her acceptance documents to Carnegie Mellon University, where she began studying fashion, stepping into a life intentionally ordinary by celebrity standards, riding public transportation, attending classes, and living without the constant pressure of being someone else's symbol. While Holmes continued to support her quietly, helping her move into dorms with tired but proud hands, knowing she had accomplished something rare in Hollywood, raising a child who survived fame, abandonment, and scrutiny without losing herself, even as Cruz continued to live a life of extremes, signing multi-million-dollar deals, preparing films supported by NASA, and risking his life on screen to global applause, all while the most personal risk, the act of walking across a room to rebuild a relationship, remained untouched. And while reports indicate he has continued to meet financial obligations, there have been no confirmed reconciliations, visits, or public acknowledgments in more than a decade, leaving Suri, now 19, to accept the silence she no longer interprets as temporary, no longer checking her phone on birthdays, no longer standing in the doorway of memory waiting for footsteps that never come, but instead building a future defined by her own name, her own ambitions, and her own truth, a story that ultimately raises an uncomfortable question, not just